Hi everyone, and welcome to week 1 of our course on the conceptual foundations of genocide. This week will be a bit longer than usual, as I need to cover a lot of ground. Let's start with this big question, which is at the core of our course. What causes genocide? This is an etiological question. Etiology is the study of causation. Now, there are two different approaches to an etiology of genocide. The first is a nomothetic approach, which seeks to produce a more generalizable knowledge. This is the approach we'll be taking this semester in Underpinnings, as we consider the conditions in which genocide occur. The second is an idiographic approach, which is relatively more particularistic. We'll take up that perspective in the spring when I teach modern genocides, where we consider the specific historical context in which genocides occur. Just as these two courses are complementary, it's important to understand that these approaches can work together. With that said, our overarching motivation in this class is to uncover the hidden causes of genocide. Elie Wiesel famously declared that Auschwitz cannot be explained, and that the Holocaust is the ultimate mystery. Hopefully, we'll never really know what the experience of genocide is actually like, but if we take seriously the dictum, "never again," then we must try to understand. Like a mechanic opens the hood of an automobile, or a surgeon looks inside a patient, we must stand before the phenomenon of genocide in order to see how it works and maybe help diagnose the problem. Here's the basic course structure, which has been thematically designed in such a way as to provide a different theoretical and disciplinary approach each week. All of these topics are comprised of various distinct research programs that you can use to navigate through the discipline in order to eventually make a contribution to the literature with your own dissertation. Consider this list of topics like a theoretical menu, where you get to pick and choose whichever approach you find most suitable for your critical needs. These options are by no means mutually exclusive, nor is this list exhaustive. There are a number of other theoretical and disciplinary approaches not listed here, such as ethics, demographics, economics, ecology, etc. So you are by no means limited to what you see here. Indeed, I encourage you to be as creative as possible, looking to combine other research programs with what you see here. Nevertheless, this structure provides a basis for mapping out the genocide studies literature. I don't want to review all of the course requirements, at least not at once, but I do need to highlight the fact that our course is built around the discussion forum. Now, this is all covered in the syllabus, but let me walk through the multiple parts to this. First, there's your weekly posting assignment. You'll open a discussion thread each and every week. As you'll see on the next slide, I'll provide a list of learning objectives each week, and from that, you'll respond to at least one, following all the basic conventions of academic writing in the form of a substantive paragraph or a mini-essay. Secondly, you're being separately assessed on your participation. At a minimum, you must respond at least twice on other discussion threads besides your own. I'm looking for substantive engagement, not pro forma responses. Finally, you have a single leadership post for 1 week of the semester. So after looking at the list of weekly topics from the previous slide, you need to send me your top 3 preferences, and I'll assign you a week. For that 1 week, you'll substitute your normal opening post with something much longer that covers all of the readings and poses questions for discussion. Be sure to note that, in order to facilitate discussion, you have to post no later than Friday midnight. I'll review the other assignments later, but without further ado, let's dive in. Here in week 1, we are looking at the conceptual foundations of genocide through the interdisciplinary lens of gender studies. Here's this week's list of learning objectives. As noted, use these as prompts for the weekly discussion forum assignments. Our big goal this week is to understand the conceptual foundations of genocide. So, where did the concept come from? When did it emerge? And what's the conceptual relationship between the Holocaust and genocide? This graph is from the Google Books Ngram viewer, and it measures the relative frequency of keywords over time. As you can see, our vocabulary words are relatively recent. The keyword genocide achieved early prominence from the 1940s through the early 70s. Yet the keyword Holocaust didn't take off until the late 1960s, and it only surpassed the popularity of the genocide keyword after the mid-1970s. The reason I'm sharing this is because we tend to take for granted the conceptual stability of the Holocaust versus genocide, the latter of which is an essentially contested concept. Yet this wasn't always the case. Moreover, the meaning of concepts, any concept, is never self-evident or natural, but is rather always constructed and open to change. Indeed, concepts aren't simply out there, waiting to be discovered. Rather, they have to be invented. This was the impetus behind Winston Churchill's famous August 1941 statement that we are in the presence of a crime without a name. English vocabulary supposedly lacked any language to capture the inherently destructive essence of Nazism, and according to the origin myth surrounding Raphael Lemkin, the ostensible quote-unquote father of our discipline, the invention of the keyword genocide heroically filled in this semantic void. While this story is often overstated, such was the rhetorical situation faced by Raphael Lemkin, who happened to have the right combination of timing and expertise while coining the word genocide in response to this particular exigency, or urgent need for new language. In this case, the notion of a rhetorical situation refers to the conditions of possibility that enabled Lemkin's neologism to get immediately adopted into the lexicon of international law and global affairs. This was a product of his circumstances. It was no accident that Lemkin, a Jew from Eastern Europe, where consciousness and experience of nationality was so intense, and where Jews had been persecuted for centuries, invented a concept to name the destruction of nationalities and pressed for its criminalization. Unfortunately, due to limitations in space and time, we'll have to forego Lemkin's fascinating biography. Rather, I want us to focus on this key conceptual relationship. On the one hand, Lemkin conceived of genocide as a generic term. He did not single out the genocide of the Jews as falling into a separate category, as some historians today distinguish Holocaust from genocide. Where Lemkin challenges contemporary orthodoxy is in his implication that the notion of a Holocaust as a specifically Jewish tragedy makes no sense, because the genocide of the Jews was just one aspect of a broad Nazi demographic plan based on extreme racial fantasies. At the same time, however, Lemkin's rhetorical situation was deeply enmeshed in the broader context of the Holocaust. Without the Nazis' attempted annihilation of European Jews and other groups, Lemkin's word might not have made it into the dictionary, and the field of genocide studies might not exist. Lemkin might have been a forgotten man, and we might very well be talking about extermination and crimes against humanity instead of genocide. In other words, no Holocaust, no Lemkin, no genocide convention, no genocide studies. My point here is to emphasize the conjunction between the Holocaust and genocide. Like a binary star solar system and astronomy, these two concepts are large gravitational masses that revolve around one another. They're distinct, yet entirely inseparable. Apart from the conceptual confusion between the Holocaust and genocide, the keyword genocide itself is inherently contested. The long-standing definitional debate goes all the way back to the 1948 Genocide Convention, which laid out the official legal meaning of genocide in Article 2. However, as indicated by the preparatory documents in Reading 2 this week, the process of defining genocide was never straightforward. This means that we cannot take for granted the authoritative language of the convention, the drafting of which was inherently politicized. Instead, we need to use these preparatory documents to peer beneath the surface of Article 2 in order to uncover its hidden genealogy. I want you to be able to outline these successive drafting stages and chart the conceptual or definitional parameters at stake here, noting how broadly the process began and how it was incrementally restricted or narrowed down over the course of the proceedings. Focus primarily on the official language and just skim over most of the commentary. There's a lot of content here that you can just breeze through, but it's a helpful resource to hold on to for the future. With that said, given our focus on genocide per se, we need to unpack the meaning of this concept, which is comprised of 4 basic elements. Genos is the root word of genocide, and it refers to the targeted group. The question is whether the genos is an objective entity or a subjective construction. Side, or side, is the well-known suffix meaning to kill, yet the scope of destructive acts remains open to debate. Intent is another necessary feature of genocide as a crime, but again, how we define intent is essentially contested. Finally, Mariology is the study of parts in relation to the wholes they form. In other words, how much of a group needs to be destroyed in order to qualify as genocide. Now you can see all of these elements are on a spectrum of interpretations. There's no single right definition, and there's considerable ambiguity over where to draw the line along any of these multiple axes. This means that genocide is an essentially contested concept. Now we're going to go through these one by one, but we'll spend most of the time looking at the genus. So what is a genus? There's a general consensus that genocide involves the destruction of groups, but what makes a genus? Is it something that's objectively real, perhaps even a product of nature? Or is it rather a social construction that is essentially manufactured? This is an ontological question. Ontology is a branch of philosophy about the study of existence. In order to unpack the group element, we have to think about the nature of social reality, because our understanding of genocide as a destructive process necessarily implies a conception of group life. Different conceptions of genocide, different conceptions of what a genus could refer to, presume different theories about the nature of social life. Thus, the ontological question becomes, what binds a group together? Moreover, who gets to decide what counts? On the one hand, we can think of the genus as having some objective basis in reality, not just in terms of a self-identified group as an intersubjective formation, but also in terms of its actual biophysical existence as a human collectivity. On the other hand is the argument that the genus functions as a labeling device for the perpetrators. It's the perpetrators who define the victims, not the other way around. That's not to say that the victims of genocide are not necessarily quote-unquote real collectivities, but that they can be constructed from the paranoid imaginations of perpetrators. For example, Stalin was obsessed with destroying his many imaginary enemies. There are other borderline cases that deal with entirely phantasmal objects of potential genocide, such as the early modern era witch hunts across Europe and North America. The imaginary construction of the victim group will be a persistent theme in this course, as we'll see in week 3 when we introduce the in-group, out-group dynamic. But these cases pose the question, can the genus be completely imaginary, a total figment of the perpetrator's imagination? And what if we stretch our thinking in the opposite direction? If we instead see the genus as an objectively real and/or organic entity, then who gets to decide what counts as real? For example, in my Native American genocides class, we talk about the Buffalo genocide in 19th century North America. The genus looks very different from the perspective of indigenous kinship theory, which often includes other than human animals. There's no easy answer to these questions, and it's fair to say that no one can have the final word here. Again, this is an essentially contested concept. Regardless of whether the genus is objectively real or subjectively imagined, or perhaps a bit of both, what is clear is that the underlying concept of the genus is inherently gendered, insofar as it specifically pertains to reproductive issues. Helen Fine, the author of Reading 2, explains that the genus infers the basic kinds, classes, or subfamilies of humanity, persisting units of society. What is distinctive sociologically is that such groups are usually ascriptive, based on birth rather than by choice. As such, she explains that genocide can occur indirectly through the interdiction of, or putting an end to, the biological and social reproduction of group members. In other words, genocide negates reproduction. So whereas reproduction serves to continue the group, genocide seeks to destroy it. Conceptually, the inherent connection between gender and genocide is evident via an etymological connection, insofar as both words derive from the Proto-Indo-European root word gene, meaning to give birth or beget. This distant linguistic ancestor produces an interesting word bank that is highly relevant to our discussion. Genocide, gender, natural, nation, and indigenous are all words that have spawned from this common etymological root word. Of course, this begs the question of reproduction in what sense? A restrictive meaning of reproduction in the biological or physical sense of the term corresponds with the narrower means of destruction, which we'll see momentarily. In contrast, the notion of social and cultural reproduction corresponds with the broader means of destruction. Okay, real quick, I just want to take a couple of brief diversions. First, I want to introduce the concept of racism as it is inherently mediated through sexuality and gender. Lurking beneath the surface of virtually any discourse about race and racism is an anxiety or concern about sexual reproduction. So, what is race? The most important thing to understand about race is that it is artificial, i.e. man-made, and my androcentrism here is deliberate. It's not a quote-unquote natural or biological category. In fact, advances in genomics have shown that there is greater variation within racial groups than between them. As an ideological formation, there are two general characteristics of race. First, it is hierarchical. Unlike some other schema of classifying humanity, race is inherently tied to power, oppression, and privilege. Quite simply, racism is prejudice plus power. Without unequal power dynamics, there can be no racism. Second, race links physical characteristics to cognitive, cultural, and moral ones. Thus, race is not a negotiable condition, but a destiny, one whose outward sign is the body. Yet the supposed immutability of race is crucially contradicted by the ideological discourse surrounding miscegenation, or the quote-unquote interbreeding of people considered to be of different racial types. The fundamentally hierarchical opposition presupposed by racism is complicated by the presence of so-called mixed-race offspring. Do the children inherit the qualities of the dominant race over the subordinate, or vice versa? Really, it depends. In my Native American genocides class, for example, we contrast the systems of racialization concerning indigenous peoples with Black Americans, for example. In cases where mixed-race offspring follow the subordinate position, as with the Nazi race laws or the Jim Crow-era one-drop rule, there's typically a fixation with preserving the supposed purity of the dominant race from contamination. Thus, we almost always see this gender dynamic in racist systems, which tend to be deeply patriarchal and obsessed with controlling women's reproductive health in the name of protecting racial security. In sum, the key point here is that, just as genocide is intrinsically gendered, racism is inherently sexualized. Now, switching gears completely, I want to take another brief diversion before we get back on track with our lesson. Every week, I'll spotlight a particular scholar whose works are important yet aren't in the syllabus. Here we see Hannah Arendt, the German-American political theorist who, like Lemkin, was part of a broader wave of Jewish intellectual refugees during World War II. These are some of her major works. We may briefly discuss the origins of totalitarianism in Week 6, and you'll almost certainly read about Eichmann and Jerusalem in Dr. Rice's Historiography of the Holocaust class. We may even touch on it in Week 5. But the point I want to make here actually comes from her book, The Human Condition. It has to do with the question, what is the distinctive harm of genocide, and what do we stand to lose from it? In our dominant liberal culture, represented here by American philosopher Larry May, the common assumption is that genocide kills individuals, and that groups do not have value in themselves. This is in stark contrast to Lemkin's original idea, which was that genocide deprives the world of a group's quote-unquote cultural contributions to civilization. I put the word cultural in inverted commas here because Lemkin's notion of culture was really about so-called high culture, the implication being that genocide against a group without high culture would be less of a loss. Now, Arendt's response is much closer in form to Lemkin's than it is to May's, but she avoids Lemkin's pretenses. Basically, she argued that genocide destroys the plurality of humanity. Indeed, Arendt's entire political philosophy was committed to the principle of plurality, which embraces both equality and diversity, given the fact that all human beings belong to the same biological family, yet everyone, both individually and collectively, is endowed with a unique biographical perspective of the world. This is essentially what we lose from genocide. The ethical question about the distinctive harm of genocide is related to another set of questions, namely, what do genocides kill? As I've already suggested, there's an inherent interdependency between the way we understand these two conceptual elements. That is to say, the way we understand the group element, i.e. the genos, determines the way we conceptualize the destructive element, i.e. the C-Day. The dominant liberal interpretation of the genos tends to see it as nothing more than the sum of individual group members. For instance, Margaret Thatcher once said that there is no such thing as society. All I know are individuals, she said. Therefore, according to this conception, what genocide really kills are individuals. That was Larry May's argument on the previous slide. Yet, a surprisingly minor tradition understands the genos as something more than the sum of the individuals who belong to it. I say surprising because this was the perspective of both Lemkin and most of the drafters of the UN Genocide Convention. In any case, if a group is something more than the sum of its individual members, then genocide involves the killing or destruction of that something more. This minor tradition is actually becoming less and less so, as the long-neglected work of Claudia Card, the author of Readings 4 and 5, is increasingly becoming a mainstream position in the discipline. She pushes back against the dominant tendency to frame the harms of genocide in terms of body counts, which presumably provides a quantitative measure of genocide as a distinct evil. No, she says, genocide is not essentially about physical death and mass murder. Rather, genocide is fundamentally about the destruction of collective identities, communal ties, and social vitality. As Card points out, the term cultural genocide is redundant because all genocides, by definition, involve the destruction of culture. This was very much the case in the Holocaust, which is often taken as an example par excellence of the misconstrued notion of genocide as mass murder. Thus, our final reading contextualizes Nazi policy toward Jewish women within Jewish theology, and leads us to understand the devastating consequences of such policy on Jewish motherhood. Now, I don't want us to focus on the particularities of this specific case. Rather, I want us to use this last reading as an example to explore the more general implications as they pertain to the concept of genocide. Genocide does indeed kill something more than just individual group members. There's a metaphysical dimension to the killing of a genos. This is what we mean by genocide as ontological destruction. And that's the key takeaway here. Now, very quickly, I want to skim through the remaining conceptual elements. I've already talked a little bit about the side or side element, i.e. the methods of destruction. Once again, we see an interpretive spectrum, which opens up the grounds for this essentially contested concept. As Helen Fine notes in Reading 2, genocide is intrinsically a fuzzy concept. Its exact borders are unclear, and there are both overlapping and marginal phenomena. And that's what I want to discuss here, genocide as a fuzzy concept. But first, let's start mapping out this interpretive spectrum. Here you see Lemkin's original 8 techniques of genocidal destruction, ranging from the physical methods at the narrow end of the spectrum to the moral techniques at the broader end. Now, by narrower, I mean to say that these are methods that attack the physical integrity of individual bodies. Broader, in this sense, refers to the methods that target the cultural integrity of collective bodies. Now, when Lemkin co-authored the first draft of the 1948 UN Genocide Convention, he came up with this tripartite conceptual framework, which pretty much covered the same spectrum but simplified it. The final draft represents a relatively more restrictive definition, but even here we have elements that point to the broader end of the spectrum, such as Article 2, Section E, on the transfer of children. Now, there are also other techniques of destruction that weren't visible to these mid-20th century, mostly male authors. Thus, Eliza von Joden-Forgy and Claudia Card direct attention to sexual and gender-based violence, so this is by no means an exclusive list. With that said, our objective here is to consider where to draw the line. What distinguishes acts of genocide from non-genocidal acts? Or is that a faulty distinction? Is there even a strict line to be found that categorically demarcates genocide from non-genocide? Next, how do we define genocidal intent? Once again, we can use the continuum-based conceptual model that corresponds with that which was provided in the previous slide, while also bringing into the fold a major debate in Holocaust historiography that you should be familiar with. So here's the analogy. The narrower conception of genocidal techniques corresponds with a theory of intentionalism that stresses the individual role of agency in the etiology of genocide, whereas the broader framework of methods corresponds with the theory of functionalism that stresses the role of structures. This debate tracks with 2 different interpretations of genocide law of the mens rea, or the mental element of the crime. On the one hand, the dominant legal interpretation since the 1990s is referred to by the Romano-Germanic civil law term, dolus specialis, or specific intent. This sets a high definitional benchmark, insofar as it obtains only when a perpetrator specifically targets victims on the basis of their group identity and with a deliberate desire to inflict destruction upon the group itself. On the other hand, there is an alternative interpretation that derives from English common law called general intent, or dolus generalis, whereby the guilty mind is established by inferring whether the perpetrator had reasonable knowledge of the natural consequences of their actions, or is otherwise aware that such an outcome will occur in the ordinary course of events, rather than clearly and explicitly intending the result. Now, our objective here isn't to pick a side in this debate. Rather, I simply want you to understand the parameters of the debate over where to draw the line. Is there a requisite threshold for determining intent? Here's the fourth and final conceptual element, which concerns the challenge of defining